Imagine the date, the 15th of July, in the year 1943. The air is thick with Pacific fog, and the port of San Francisco hums with the quiet, powerful sounds of a nation at war. Against the midnight lights, giant cranes move like ghosts, and massive cargo ships are being tied down. On the dock, surrounded by armed American soldiers, stand nearly 200 Japanese women. They are nurses, secretaries, and clerks, captured in the far-flung battles of the Pacific, from the freezing Aleutian Islands to other remote war zones. Their uniforms are thin and patched, their faces hollow, and their eyes hold the vacant look of people who have seen too much and slept too little. A heavy, suffocating silence hangs over them. It's broken only by the faintest whispers, fragments of pure dread passed from one woman to another. The rumors had spread like a disease through the prisoner columns. What will they do to us? The whispers gave the answer they all feared. American soldiers, they were told, would violate them. They would be sold into slavery, or worse, paraded through the streets as war trophies. One phrase, repeated in nervous, shallow breaths, becomes a shared mantra of terror. A phrase spoken in shame and disbelief. They are going to rape us. They had all heard the stories. Some came from propaganda leaflets dropped from the sky. Others from the solemn warnings of their own officers just before capture. They all braced for the worst kind of humiliation. What they could not brace for, what not even the most cynical or imaginative mind could have possibly invented, was the sight that would greet them when they finally arrived at their destination. A camp in the middle of America, in a place called Wisconsin. There, on neatly made beds with crisp, clean sheets, sat dozens of small, silent figures. Stuffed teddy bears, each with button eyes and a hand-stitched smile. It was a moment that made no sense. It was the beginning of a story that no one in Tokyo could have ever made up. A story that would begin to dismantle, piece by piece, everything these women had been taught to believe about the cruelty of their enemy. They were about to experience a different kind of American power, not of bombs and bullets, but of mercy, gentleness, and a generosity so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend. Their old world had ended in a place of wind and silence. The Aleutian Islands were a land of jagged mountains wrapped in fog, where the sea pounded relentlessly against black volcanic rock. In the spring of 1943, the last of Japan's northern garrisons had collapsed. On the island of Attu, entire units were wiped out in a final, desperate charge, with men throwing themselves at machine guns in a defiant refusal to surrender. On Kiska, starvation, frostbite, and endless bombings had left the survivors broken in body and spirit. For the women assigned to these remote outposts, the nurses, typists, and clerks, the orders had been clear from the very beginning. Capture was a fate worse than death. They were told that the Americans would violate them, enslave them, and parade them as trophies of war. They were issued pistols and even cyanide capsules with whispered instructions to choose honor over the shame of captivity. But when the end finally came, it wasn't the theater of glorious death they had been prepared for. It was something else entirely. American soldiers stormed into the half-frozen bunkers and tunnels, weapons at the ready, expecting resistance. Instead, they found shivering women in tattered uniforms, clutching rusted pistols, most of them without ammunition. Some raised their hands in surrender, trembling. Others pressed the muzzles of their empty guns to their own heads. The first American officer on the scene, a lieutenant from the 7th Infantry Division, didn't bark orders to shoot. He didn't shout insults. He gave orders to secure them. And then something impossible happened. Medics began moving through the group, distributing blankets. They poured hot coffee into dented tin cups and pressed chocolate bars into hands that hadn't felt warmth or sugar in months. The prisoners just looked at each other in utter bewilderment. Where was the promised brutality? Where were the jeers and the ropes? Instead, there were clipboards, translators, and meticulously taken notes. Each woman was asked her name, her rank, and her medical condition. A female Japanese-American interpreter explained in careful, polite Japanese that they were now protected under the Geneva Convention. They would not be harmed. They would be given food, clothing, and medical care. It was incomprehensible. Everything they had been taught about the barbaric enemy fractured in that single moment. On a windswept beach, the women sat wrapped in olive-drab army blankets. The smell of beef and potato stew drifted from steaming pots. One nurse, who had been taught her whole life that Americans would treat her as less than human, wept quietly as she swallowed spoonfuls of warm broth. Another stared at a piece of bread she was given, convinced it must be laced with poison. That night, they whispered to each other, certain that this kindness was just an act, a cruel trick before the real torment began. But as the days went on, the kindness continued. The voyage across the Pacific Ocean was supposed to be the next stage of their humiliation. They were marched onto a transport ship, their hearts pounding with terror. They expected to be herded into dark, filthy holds like cattle, starved and mocked until their spirits were crushed. Instead, they were guided into separate cabins with rows of bunks, neatly made with clean sheets and folded blankets. The air smelled of disinfectant, not filth. A nurse who had braced herself for the stench of a prison ship collapsed onto a mattress in disbelief. "This isn't captivity," she whispered to the woman next to her. "This is like an inn." And then came the food. At regular intervals, stewards arrived with trays piled high with steaming beef stew, loaves of bread still warm from the ship's galley, and tins of fruit heavy with syrup. They were served rich black coffee, a luxury many had never even tasted. At first, they were suspicious, but hunger soon won out. One woman later admitted in a secret diary, "The Americans gave us meals more plentiful than our soldiers in Manchuria ever received. We ate until our stomachs ached, and still there was food left over." But the most bewildering sight was not what they were given, but what the American sailors threw away. Bread with a single spot of mold was tossed into the sea. Bananas with small brown marks were thrown overboard. The Japanese women watched in stunned silence as food that could have fed entire villages back home vanished into the dark water. It revealed something more terrifying than cruelty, an abundance so vast that waste meant nothing. They were given toothpastes, soap, sanitary cloths, and combs. For women who had gone months without proper hygiene, these small comforts felt like treasures. The simple act of brushing their teeth, of feeling clean, made them feel human again. The ship eventually slid into San Francisco Bay under a thick blanket of fog. The women gathered at the rails, expecting to be met with hostile crowds. But the docks were filled with workers too busy to pay them much attention. No one spat, no one hurled insults. In the distance, a group of schoolchildren waved timidly. The prisoners who had prepared for hatred were met with something far stranger: indifference. The journey continued by train, cutting eastward into the heart of the country. Through the windows, they saw a nation that defied all propaganda. They saw small towns glowing with electric lights, shop windows filled with clothing and toys, and children riding bicycles down quiet streets. In Japan, metal was so scarce that a bicycle was an unimaginable luxury. Here, it was a child's toy. Every farm they passed was lit with electricity. Kitchens spilled warm light into the fields. A nurse from Nagoya whispered, "We were told Americans lived like beasts, but I see gardens, houses with painted fences, and women wearing dresses finer than anything we could dream of." In the silence of the train car, the women understood a truth more terrifying than any battlefield defeat. The enemy's strength wasn't just in its weapons, but in a prosperity so vast, so casual, that it made their own sacrifices feel like ashes. The long train ride finally ended in the heart of Wisconsin. The gates of Camp McCoy loomed before them, with high fences crowned with barbed wire and guard towers silhouetted against the sky. This was it. This was the place where the real horror would begin. As the barracks doors opened, the women braced themselves for the cold, hard reality of a prison camp. Instead, they froze in stunned silence. The room was warm, lit by bright, steady electric lights. Wooden bunks stood in neat rows, each with a mattress, clean sheets, and a folded wool blanket. And on each bed, placed with deliberate care, sat a small, silent welcome. A teddy bear, a rag doll, some with button eyes, others with simple, stitched smiles. The women could not process what they were seeing. It was too strange, too impossible. Some just stared, their minds unable to make sense of it. A few reached out with trembling hands to pick up the stuffed animals, holding them as if they might contain some hidden poison. Then, one nurse from Kyoto burst into tears the moment her fingers closed around the soft fabric of a doll. She clutched it to her chest, her body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than fear. Another woman whispered that it had to be a trick, a cruel joke, to remind them of the children they would never see again. But then the guards explained, awkwardly but sincerely, that the gifts had been donated by local church groups and the Red Cross. Women in nearby towns had sewn them, hoping to offer a small measure of comfort to strangers they would never meet. The explanation only deepened the shock. They had been taught that Americans were demons, bent on humiliation. Yet here was evidence of a quiet, unassuming tenderness, freely given. One woman sat on her bunk, clutching a teddy bear so tightly her knuckles turned white. She remembered her own son, left behind in Yokohama, his small hands clutching a similar toy before the air raids began. For her, the bear was not a gift, it was a memory, brought back to life. A piece of her own humanity returned to her in a place where she had expected only despair. That night, as the women lay under their warm blankets with the toys beside them, a profound and unsettling silence fell over the barracks. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was something deeper. How could the enemy show them such gentleness when their own leaders had only offered them commands to die? For many, the teddy bears and dolls were not just gifts. They were quiet, undeniable proof that the world they had been taught to believe in was a lie. The first days in Camp McCoy slowly turned into weeks, and the initial shock settled into a strange, unsettling rhythm. Life in captivity was nothing like they had been told. They were given plain but sturdy uniforms, thick woolen coats, and serviceable shoes. To women who had been patching clothes until they were nothing but threads, walking in shoes that didn't leak felt like a forgotten dream. The meals continued to be a source of constant amazement. There was meat, pork chops, beef stew, chicken, foods that had vanished from civilian tables in Japan years ago. There were bowls of fruit and tall glasses of milk at breakfast. They whispered to each other that it couldn't be real, but the abundance never stopped. They were allowed to write letters, and when replies from their families arrived months later, carried across the world by the Red Cross, the realization dawned. Their captors were allowing them to have a voice. A camp library was stocked with books in both English and Japanese. They attended classes, learning not just the enemy's language, but also arithmetic and hygiene. To be offered an education as a prisoner was more stunning than the endless food. The conduct of the guards continued to confound them. They were young men, often shy and polite, who addressed the women with a formal respect. The whispers of violation that had haunted them on their journey faded completely. In fact, when one guard was accused of making an inappropriate remark, he was immediately removed and disciplined. For women who came from a military culture where striking a subordinate was common, this act of accountability was incomprehensible. The camp was no longer a place of punishment. It was becoming an education in another way of living. Captivity had not destroyed them. It was transforming them. As the war effort demanded more workers, the women were given labor assignments outside the camp fences. This brought a new wave of fear. They would now be exposed to American civilians, the very people whose sons and husbands were fighting their country. They expected jeers, hatred, maybe even stones thrown at them.
They were sent to work in sewing workshops, canning factories, and farmlands. And it was in the fields beneath the wide Midwestern sky that the most surprising encounters occurred. The women worked silently at first, their eyes lowered, but soon small gestures began to break through the wall of suspicion. A farmer's wife brought out a basket of sandwiches. Another offered pitchers of cold lemonade in the summer heat. Children would wander close, holding out wildflowers or small scribbled drawings. One incident was retold in whispers for weeks. A young prisoner, weakened by years of poor nutrition, collapsed in the heat. Before the guards could react, the farm family rushed forward. The farmer lifted the woman in his arms and carried her into the cool of his home. He laid her gently on a sofa, and his wife fanned her and gave her a glass of ice water. That an enemy family would bring a prisoner into their home and treat her with such tenderness shattered every remaining piece of propaganda. In secretly kept diaries, the women recorded their astonishment. "They treat us not as enemies, but as human beings," one nurse wrote. Another confessed, "I felt shame. We were told Americans were demons, yet their children smiled at us." The iron wall of propaganda was crumbling, not under the force of weapons, but under the weight of a sandwich, a smile, and a child's simple drawing.
As December arrived, snow fell softly on the barracks of Camp McCoy. The women noticed strange preparations. Guards were more cheerful, pine branches appeared in the mess hall, and unfamiliar music drifted from the camp chapel. They had heard the word Christmas, but they never imagined it would have anything to do with them. On the morning of December 25, 1943, they awoke to another surprise. On each bunk lay small packages. Some contained hand-knitted scarves, others bars of scented soap, and still others small cakes wrapped in wax paper. Children from nearby towns had made cards with simple drawings and messages clumsily translated into Japanese. Bright crayon suns and stick figure families smiled up at them. For the prisoners, the sight was overwhelming. They had braced for cruelty and had been met with a constant, gentle kindness that they still couldn't fully comprehend. Some women clutched the gifts and wept openly. One nurse whispered she hadn't held a piece of soap in 2 years, and now she had been given one as a gift. Another, biting into a small cake, cried because it tasted like a sweet she had eaten as a girl, before the war had stripped everything away. Later that day, they were invited to the camp hall. An American choir of young men and women stood before them and began to sing Christmas carols. But they sang not only in English. They had painstakingly learned the words to Silent Night and other carols in Japanese. As the familiar melody, now sung in their own language, carried across the frosted air, something broke. A few prisoners began to sing along, their voices halting, their eyes glistening with tears. It was a moment of profound transformation. They had been told to expect degradation. Instead, they were given warmth, dignity, and joy. A woman later wrote in her memoir, "They gave us gifts, though we were their enemies. We realized then that their strength was not in weapons, but in their hearts." The Christmas of 1943 was the moment when fear finally dissolved, replaced by a bewildering respect and gratitude for the nation they had been raised to despise. When the guns finally fell silent in the summer of 1945, the women of Camp McCoy faced an uncertain future. The war was over. They were going home. But home was a place they no longer knew. Japan was in ruins, its cities flattened by bombs, its people starving. They boarded the ships to return home, but this journey was different. They were no longer filled with terror, but with a complex mix of relief, sadness, and a quiet, unshakable knowledge. They carried with them not only the clothes and small gifts from the Americans, but also the memory of being treated with a dignity their own nation had often denied them. Some wept silently as the coast of America slipped away, not because they were leaving a prison, but because they feared what awaited them in a world that no longer made sense. They returned to a homeland of rubble and grief. Their neighbors often viewed them with suspicion, whispering that to be captured was a dishonor. But inside these women, a different truth burned.
They had seen the humanity of their enemy, and that memory was stronger than any insult. In time, they began to speak. They told their children and grandchildren stories of guards who blushed, of farmers' wives who offered lemonade, and of Christmas mornings filled with the scent of soap and the sound of songs sung in their own language. A few, unable to reconcile the kindness they had found in America with the devastation of their homeland, chose to return. In the decades that followed, a small but steady stream of these former prisoners immigrated to the United States. They became teachers, nurses, and mothers, building new lives in the country that had once been the enemy. Years later, at reunions, they would gather now old women with gray hair and soft smiles. They would bring their relics, a faded teddy bear missing an ear, a scarf knitted in 1943. They held them up as sacred objects, proof of the moment they realized the world was bigger and more complicated than they had ever been told. What began with a whisper of fear on a dark dock in San Francisco ended with a powerful testimony of compassion. They had entered captivity expecting to be broken. They emerged with a story that proved, even in the darkest hours of war, humanity can survive.